Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so delighted to welcome you today to this fabulous event. We're continuing to celebrate Women's History Month right to the end of the month, and we're so delighted that you can be with us. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Dr. Bernice Ledbetter. I serve as the Dean of Students and Alumni Affairs, and I also serve as the founder and director for the Center for Women in Leadership at the Pepperdine Graziadio Business School. I'm so thrilled for you to join us for this very special event today. We are acknowledging the accomplishments of women, and we are acknowledging the accomplishments of one of our very special alumna, Stacey Gordon, in the launch of her book, Unbias. I want to share a word about the Center for Women in Leadership for those of you who might be unfamiliar with our work. We exist to advance women to the highest levels of leadership. We do that through mentoring, through learning opportunities such as this one, and leadership development programs. I also want to say a word about why the topic today. This topic, unconscious bias in the workplace, is timely and important. In order to recognize the importance of persistent barriers that women have to face and other underrepresented groups in the advancement of leadership in the workplace, we have to talk about unconscious bias. It's one of the most persistent barriers. And because we want to think about how we increase equity, inclusion, and belonging in our workplace, we also can't do that unless we address this persistent barrier. And so we're so delighted and grateful to Stacey and for the work that she's done in this area to help us understand this topic more completely and more deeply. Let me give you a quick overview of what we're going to be up to today. In a moment, I'll introduce our keynote conversation partners, and we'll hold our Q&A to the end, but feel free to post in the chat as we're going. And also, I'd like to invite David now to drop in a networking form. If you would like to share your LinkedIn URL with the group, we'll collect all of those and we'll send those to you after the event. So if you'd like to kind of get to know some of the other participants on the webinar today, we have over 100 people here right now. You're welcome to do that. At the conclusion of our time together this afternoon, we'll also do a poll. We'd love to get your feedback on this webinar. And so towards the end, we'll ask you to give us your quick feedback about your experience today. So let me introduce our very special guests. Stacey Gordon is the CEO and founder of Rework Work. And she has dedicated herself to helping others understand diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to actively remove bias from the workplace. Stacey has given her time to dismantling unhealthy workplaces. And that really means more than just talking about it. It means not just dealing with graphs and charts and statistics. It's really about also addressing bias in the culture that gets created in our organizations. And that's what she's done in this very unique and wonderful book. Stacey is a proud alumna of the Pepperdine Graziadio Business School, and she also serves on the executive board for the Center for Women in Leadership. She is focused on creating inclusive workplaces and inclusive cultures, and she has given speeches and consulted and developed with educational organizations and also engaged with organizations globally, both in person and virtually. She focuses on reworking how companies work, including how they create inclusive processes for recruitment, hiring, and engaging employees effectively, thereby creating inclusive and belonging for all. She is the creator of the #1 resume course on LinkedIn, and she is also the creator of one of the best classes on LinkedIn Learning for unconscious bias. I encourage you to take a look at that. Stacey has written articles and provided content for SHRM, for Fast Company, Skillsoft, Forbes, NPR, BBC Radio, Essence Magazine, and Monster.com, to name a few. She is also a career segment guest contributor to Fox Business. And most recently, Stacey Gordon is the author of Unbias, Addressing Unconscious Bias at Work. Today, this book launches. And so you are part of the celebration of the launch of this book. You can find it on Amazon. Today is the first day that it is available. Writing a book is like giving birth to a child. It's a lot of work. And when you get to the finish line, it's unbelievable. So we're so happy and thrilled to celebrate this with Stacey today. Joining Stacey is Kim Blue Terell. Kim is the Vice President for People Experience at Zoom. We've all become so familiar with this company, we feel like we're members of it ourselves in many ways. Kim is a human resources executive serving as a strategic and data-focused leader with over 15 years of experience developing and executing human resource strategies for employee populations in the fields of industries of technology, telecommunications, and entertainment. She has served in many, many senior roles at the following companies: Zoom. She served as the senior HR manager for the Eastern region of the US for Microsoft, and she served as the senior HR business partner for the content division and technology division of ESPN. Kim is a people strategist who brings expertise in employee relations, leadership development, organizational development, diversity and inclusion, change management, and data analytics. Kim also serves on the executive board for the Black in HR organization. Please join me and give a warm shout out to our speakers. Show your love in the chat for Stacey Gordon and Kim Blue. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ledbetter. Really appreciate the great intro and so excited to be here. It is book launch day, yay! And so this is going to be a great conversation because, having this conversation with Kim, who has such a wealth of HR expertise, I thought perfect pairing, right, to talk about diversity and inclusion. People assume it falls under HR, but we all know better. Right? We know where it really needs to be. And so to have this conversation today, I think will be eye-opening and informative. And as was mentioned, if you do have questions, please do put them into the chat or the Q&A because Christina will be monitoring that and we'll introduce her as well later. But we will be taking your questions. So don't hold back on those, right? But I think starting the conversation with Kim, we really wanted to just kind of kick it off talking about some of the tenets, right, in the book, where we're talking about unbiased. And I have a copy of it here. So for those of you that pre-ordered, let me just say thank you. This is, I can't do this, right, because I have a background, but I am holding the book, right? So those of you that pre-ordered, thank you. For those of you that have it in front of you, thank you. And I know for many of you, it's on the way. As Bernice said, it is a labor of love. And so, but this work is a labor of love, right, Kim? I think that's part of it. So Kim's background, I want to say HR, but you have expertise in this field as well, right?
So first of all, congratulations on launching this book. I have been following your career and your journey on LinkedIn for a long time. So when you very confidently invited me to join you, I was extremely flattered, but also so excited to just see this labor of love come to fruition for somebody who is really committed to not only the bridge building work, but just the knowledge lane and the passion that comes behind doing this. So not only is writing a book the labor of love, but quite frankly, just staying committed to this work and staying connected to others who you also recognize are committed to their knowledge lanes and labor of love. So just huge congratulations to you. I'm so excited to be here with you. And I think you make a really good point. And this is a conversation that I've been listening to in different capacities and reading about this notion of diversity and inclusion, kind of where it sits in the house, and right. And so you're seeing companies that are becoming much more aware of where the placement of DE&I or DE&IB or however you frame it for your organization is, but it's very HR adjacent. That's what I would say. And all the organizations that I've had the pleasure of working with have embedded it into the human resources function because it is really about people. And I think when we get into some of the concepts that you discuss in your book, and in particular, bias and unconscious bias and how we talk about that, it is really related to a lot of, these behaviors and some of the things that you highlight, in your book. I don't want to spoil it for too many people, but I will pull some things that stuck out to me initially. So I love the way that you open the book because it really sets the tone and the frame for how people need to think. And for somebody who is a people strategy leader, right? When I'm thinking about sort of the how or the path, right? Inclusion is always a part of that. And then helping to shape the way people approach things, or helping them come to the table with some of their own knowledge and saying, this is something that I need to acknowledge, right? And if we're not talking about it, are we missing an opportunity to be talking about it? And you address that right off the, right from the beginning of your book. And I love the way that you kind of frame it. And I'm gonna give it to you because I want you to touch on that point, because it's one of the first things that captured me, is this notion of, you talk about troubling statements, and you talk about, how if we're not talking about it, we're missing out.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point, right? I mean, some of these concepts, you think they feel so elementary, right? It's like we just need to talk about it. But the more that we're working with organizations, the more you see that that is something that gets missed, right? It's such a simple step that it gets skipped over. And so I think that we have to really see that everyone has to start really talking about what is happening. And what we see is that in a lot of places, there's this thought that, well, if we're not hearing anything, so we must be fine, right? Everyone's quiet. No one's talking about these issues, which means we don't have any issues. And it's like, no, that's actually the opposite. They're not talking about it. You have a big problem because it means people do not feel safe to talk about it. It means that people don't have the culture that has been created and cultivated in order for people to be able to talk about it. So that's like the first part is like, gosh, let's just talk about it.
And I find even sometimes people don't know how, like what is their entry point, right? Where do they start? And there's no, opportunity to just comfortably to, and you talk about safe spaces and, right, this notion of how are we speaking, or, can we get there? But I find a lot of people are just unsure of what to say or where to begin, right? And so, and you talk about excuses earlier in your book, right? And you open up by saying, things like, well, this doesn't work or that doesn't work. But I think sometimes an excuse to the conversation could be, well, I don't know what to say. Well, there's a part of your truth, and then part of that vulnerability, and we can touch on vulnerability, a little later, right? But there's a part of that vulnerability that is very human, that helps get the conversation going. And so how do we, get around the excuses and really find opportunities to connect so that we can have the conversation? And I find that in the work that I do, half of the challenge is just bringing people to the table to say, do you want to have it? And if
Yes.
Right, number one, do you
right.
you,
It's like, do you actually want to have this conversation?
do you want to have this conversation, which I know resonates with you 100%, right? But do you want to have this conversation? Let's start there. And if you want to have it, are you okay sitting in the seat of discomfort and owning some things, number one, about yourself? And then number two, right, leveraging that as a part of your knowledge path to say, okay, now I have some understanding, or now I've got some of the work that I need to do identified or outlined, right? But not wanting to have the conversation, or not wanting to be a part of whatever change you seek or whatever you're pursuing, right? That's such an important first step, because if you don't want to have the conversation, then that's going to create a whole different experience for everybody around you, right?
Yeah.
But if you do, then I think, they don't create those barriers to forward progression, or barriers to entry into whatever the next phase or opportunity is going to be.
Yeah. Well, and you make a good point, right? Like, it's a valid point that I don't know what to say. And I always say, then say that, right? Be authentic and say that. But if you don't say anything at all because you don't know what to say, or you say what you think you need to say, right? You go along with these tropes, these phrases that we consistently say over and over again. We know those things don't ring true. So neither one of those. It's like a conversation I had with a client one time. We were doing sessions, and I said, if you don't know whether to call me Black or African American, you could just ask.
Mhm.
Because Kim might prefer Black, I might prefer African American. You don't know that. And just because I say Black doesn't mean that that applies to all Black people, right?
Exactly.
And so we have to stop looking for the shortcuts. It's like, how can I group everyone under the same umbrella? You can't. We are individuals, right? It's for the same reason you wouldn't look at a woman wearing a skirt and assume that every woman likes to wear skirts, right? Because this one woman's wearing one,
Exactly.
right? That's
Exactly.
not how it works.
You're right. It's not cookie cutter. And if we're talking about inclusion, right, it certainly doesn't, I think, and I would love for you to speak to this with some of the work that you're doing, right? But it's not inclusive in the spirit of being open to applying sort of sweeping generalizations to one person or to one, school of thought or to one thing. To your point, right? If you see a woman in a skirt, you can't assume that every woman likes to wear a skirt, right? That is a generalization. And then that leads into schools of thought that are aligned to bias or aligned to other things that are bias adjacent, as I like to call it,
Right.
right? So I would right. So I would love to hear you, you talked about some of that in your work, but like how does this show up for you when you are doing some of your coaching or when you're working with some of the clients that you work with, kind of going back to well, we don't know where to start piece. How are you connecting the dots for them and or helping them connect the dots and bringing them along the journey to say it's okay to start here and it's okay to
Yeah.
say this. And at the same time saying maybe this is not something that you say and why, right? And attaching it to this, definition of bias or this approach to how we think and perceive.
Yes, and it goes also to I'm a very direct person. I understand not everyone is going to be as direct as I am, right? But I ask you to embrace a little bit of that because, again, where do we start? Well, you don't know if you don't ask, right? When we say not cookie cutter, that's also the same for companies. Companies they'll reach out to me and say, Stacey, we need help in this area, but we're in pharmaceuticals. Have you worked with other pharmaceutical companies before? Why? Why do you care? What industry, right? You're trying to look backwards to move forward. It's like we need to be evolutionary, right? We need to be looking at what is happening forward. Stop looking at what your competitors have done. Stop looking at what Google might have done. That's great for Google, but is that going to work for you? So you got to look at what's happening in your company with your people, right? And ask them, will this work for us?
Yes.
And that's part of that conversation is that helps you figure out where do you start, because you start with the people that you work with and you ask them. These companies are doing these engagement surveys every year. What is in that engagement survey, right? What are you asking people? And are those questions really giving you information that you can act on? And if they are giving you information that you can act on, are you acting on it? How many engagement surveys come down the pike and then you do like one or two things and you forget about it? It's like there's a ton of information and data in there. Look at it, use it, right? And then if you're not sure what to make of it, focus groups, interviews with individuals from different corners of your company, from different levels, different geographies, and ask them, right? Like, what does that look like? What do we need to do? And how can we get clarity around this issue? Because what we need to do for us today is going to be different than what Google needs to do and what Facebook needs to do and what Microsoft needs to do.
Yes. I think you raised such an important point around what does that look like? That's such a pivotal question because sometimes defining that is the beginning of the journey because that's where a lot of the discovery happens. That is where a lot of sort of the light bulbs go off and people start to say, okay, now I can start to put the pieces together around what this means for me, what this is for the culture that we work in, right? Like what is this, right? What is the unique culture or the unique experience or that we're trying to cultivate here. And you're right. Just because Google's doing something, that doesn't mean it's going to be the same for Amazon or the same for Facebook or the same for Zoom, right? Everybody's culture is different. Not only that, a reminder that you're bringing a unique set of lived experiences to the table, right? So all of those lived experiences are going to be what shapes how people show up, how people know what words to use or what to say or what not to say, right? And people are going to have different levels of comfort being more direct or being open enough to say, I don't know what to say, or being open enough to say, you know what, I don't know what to say, but I'm saying it. And here I am owning the space that I'm in, or sharing their willingness to learn or be exposed a little bit or be a little bit vulnerable, right? And I think this is really key when we talk about leadership. And I say this as somebody who sits in the seat of leadership, right? And so we talk about this notion of the tone at the top. And so are we seeing this from our leaders? Are we seeing this from the people who are key influencers, who drive the strategic approach that the organization is going to take? And what does that look like, right? It goes back to that question that you asked, what does it look like? And then how are we, encouraging that to trickle down into the organization, and realizing that what we do in our house, right? This is our span of control right here. We can't be worried about the comparisons. We cannot be worried about trying to keep up. What we need to do is cultivate what's happening in front of us, right? And ensure that the way that we're asking things to trickle down, it trickles back up, right? Because we want to hear from our culture that the things that they're seeing at the top of the things that they are seeing from us are really true to what it is that we aspire to, right? So take me through how you help define this process for leaders, right? Because I can only imagine the conversations you have with leaders when they are trying to figure out, like, where do I start? Right? Like, what do I do? What's important for me to consider? Like, how are you bringing them through, the steps that you outline in your book, or how do you help them identify the phase that they may be in?
Yes. So we really, the framework. So the book is built on the framework that we have. We have a DEI blueprint on my website. It's actually free. We have people just take it. And you end up in 4 places, right? Either awareness, alignment, action, or advocacy. 4 A's, right? And awareness is where we have to start. So we will bring people back there. So last year, it felt like everyone had a blueprint where they were coming to us and they were saying, well, we hired a chief diversity officer, we started a DEI council, and we need to do unconscious bias training, right? It's like, that was the trifecta of DEI for all of 2020. No one wavered from that. And my question always was, okay, that's great, but how do you know you need unconscious bias training?
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
How do you know that starting with the DEI council was the first thing you actually needed to do? Who's on this DEI council? How did they get to be there? What are they going to do? What's their mandate? What's their mandate? What does success look like, right? What are all these things? And so what we would have to do is bring them back and go, okay, I know you started in action. You wanted to jump in and do something because I'm sure your employees they're telling you, you need to do something. Part of doing something might be saying, we are going to do something, but we're going to do something that is deliberate and that is authentic and that is based in facts for our company. So we're actually not going to do this right now. We're going to go back, right? And we're going to start with the questions. What do we need, right? Go through that process. Then we're going to align that for the leadership, right? We need to align what we're doing with what we have discovered. So here's our company strategy overall. And now let's make sure that what we've uncovered, we can figure out how we make sure we're still moving the company forward in terms of our strategy, but we're aligning it to the DEI. Because most people are trying to do it separate as an initiative. DEI is not an initiative. It is part and parcel of what you are doing.
I know you, and will you say that again, please, for the people in the back and the people in the front? Because I just want to.
Like, DEI is not an initiative. It is part of, it's the reason I say diversity recruiting doesn't exist, right? Diversity recruiting is just good recruiting. Inclusive leadership, just good leadership, right? If you are a great leader, you are automatically an inclusive leader. They are not separate. You can't take the things and take them apart, right? So it has to be embedded, and that's what we work to do. And that's where I think HR comes in and starting to look at then the practices, the policies, the procedures, and how are you making that actionable, right? HR comes in step 3, action.
Yes. So I want to touch on that, because some of the work that I have the pleasure of partnering with inside my organization is around that unification and bringing some things together. And I'm fortunate to have some amazing peers who are looking at this work every day and are saying, we have an opportunity here to bring the DE&I philosophy and look at how we overlap it with our recruitment strategies and our recruitment philosophy, and where are the places that we can ensure that we are filling the gaps and that we are making the educational opportunity for, our recruiters or our recruiting team available, right? And so it is literally taking that and bringing it across everything that we do. It's all a part of the fabric of the organization, from values to the way that we onboard, to the way that we have our conversations when we are talking to folks about their lived experiences, or even if we're commenting about things that are happening out in the world, right? There's been so much unrest that's been taking place lately. And I love this notion of being able to just say, we're acknowledging it. We don't have the answer, right? But we want to show up and know that, want you to know that we're here. And we may not be able to offer anything other than resources that invite safe space, right? But they're setting the tone again, and that's going back to the tone at the top. And then it's taking the components of the strategy, right? This humanization that we need to add to our processes, right? When we talk about the HR side of this, and this is what I mean when I say that most organizations that I've sat with, DE&I has fallen underneath human resources, but it's very HR adjacent in that it is its own thing that needs to grow and breathe, but it has such deep roots and connection points to every single other aspect of the organization. And good leaders see that, and they're engaged with their diversity partner or diversity practitioners, right? And so I love that you bring up that point, right? And you're saying it's not an initiative, because it's not. It is literally a part of the way we live and work and the way people interact with the brand, right? And I'm not going to say with our brand, but whatever brand you represent, for those of you who are joining us, right? It is literally a part of the brand, right? And I want to go back to something that I said on values, because you touched on this a little bit earlier when you were saying, there's these 4 steps that we have, right? Being able to define your values as an organization is so critical to the success and the foundation of your inclusion strategy, so that you can have more of that clarity and that grounding and that point that you can come back to say, ultimately, do the things we want to do or the way we want to operate align with our principles? Do they align with our values? And is that how we want people to experience us, right? Is that, and I see you smiling, because I feel like there might be a story there or something that you may want to share, but ultimately, is that how we want people to experience us? And so when you talk about, your 4 A's, right? Take me through a little bit of how you view the values piece of that, because you talk about that in the book as well. And that really resonated with me as a leader, sort of this notion of clearly defining your values and then operating from that in everything that you do.
Yeah, it is such a great point, because the values aspect, I have to challenge leaders today and say, do you know what the values of your organization are, right? Do you know? Because many of them probably don't. And so that's the first step, is like, what are the values? Identifying them, and it might be redefining them, right? Because especially for some older organizations that have been around a long time, you created values a long time ago. Have they been updated, right? Because when you think about what those values are and how they affect the way that people work in the workplace. And one example is working with a company, and they said, one of their values is that they get things done quickly. They're first to market. Okay, that's fine, right? So they value things being done quickly. But when you do things quickly, what happens, right? This is where we understand that if you're doing things quickly, we know when you're making decisions, that's a time that bias is always going to sneak in, right? Because you need to get it fast, you need to get it done, and you don't have time to wait. And who has time to wait for input from other people? And we're just going to move, right? So if that's a value, but you also want diversity and inclusion to be something that you were thinking about, you have to figure out, well, how are we going to still get things done quickly, but also ensure that we are taking the time to make sure that the decisions are getting made fairly, right? Yeah. So that then takes meaning, maybe it means you now have to take your go-to-market strategy, which was a 6-week strategy. Now maybe it's an 8-week strategy, right? Yeah. Maybe it's a 10-week strategy. You got to start going backwards and figuring out where can we put in these places to pause and make some more clear and deliberate decisions rather than ones that are just on the go, that are the ones that are going to be probably filled with bias.
It's almost like you're talking about this decision-making framework. Like the change agent in me and the strategist in me is all excited, right? But I hear you talking about this framework, and it's such an opportunity to like pause. One of the things that I say, to the Zoomies that I work with. So, a big, huge shout out to any Zoomies that are on, right? But I say often, or I have in my tenure with Zoom so far, right, is sometimes we have to go slow to go fast. And then that going slow, right, is intentionality. And that's really what I heard you saying a few minutes ago, right? It's just what is the intentionality that we have behind the decision making, behind aligning our values, behind defining our values, right? And how are we spending that time there? So to your point, if we have a 6-week timeline, do we need to back it up and cushion in an additional 4 weeks to make sure that we're getting it right, right? But we're also clear and we've got the right places to go back to, or when we look at our foundation to make sure those are the things that we always know if we do go back to them, they are going to springboard us in the direction that we need to, so that we are not, you know, up against any type of bias or any type of, anything that's going to, hinder us or shortchange us. So how do you define bias? Tell me that. Like, how do you, like, is it an evolving definition, right? Or how do you do it? Or does it depend on kind of what you've observed or the discovery that you're doing?
Yeah, I think, we talk about bias, we talk about the fact that it is, when we hear bias, we think it's a negative, right? We think bias is a negative thing, and it isn't necessarily. It is just a state of being, right? It's the way our brains are programmed, and we're socialized, right, into a lot of the bias. The bias that we see in America is going to be different someplace else, right? Because of our culture. It gets affected by our culture, by geography, by family status, all these different things. And so it's actually interesting that you asked this, because this morning I was on a call, actually I was doing a radio interview, and I gave the example, one of the consultants that I work with, we give this example all the time where an individual, we were at a client and we needed some help from IT, and the IT person came over to us, and it was a woman. And so after she left and she'd helped us, she said to me, she goes, "Oh my goodness." She goes, "I had to pause for a second because I was like, oh, it just didn't register, like, because I was expecting a man, right?" And so I said, "That's an example of bias." So I kind of got challenged on that. They're like, "Well, what do you mean? That's not bias." And I said, "Well, it is, because we have an expectation, right? There's a box that we are socialized to believe that people should fit into. So if I am socialized to believe that, there's a reason the phrase is IT guy, right? Like, that exists for a reason.
Yes.
So it's not that there was anything negative or bad out of that, right? It was just an observation that she had where she was like, "Oh my goodness, I had that realization that I was expecting to see a man, and it jolted me." So it's the same when we say CEO and you think man, and so the question that comes up is like, well, how is that bad? And I'm like, it's bad when you think about, one, we don't necessarily think about women as doctors, right? We've kind of gotten over that a little bit more, but we don't necessarily think of them as surgeons, right? We say surgeon, we still think man. And there are plenty of Black doctors who've had patients who refused treatment, right? Because they did not want to be treated by a Black doctor. So that's an example of, I have a bias that doctors should be white, or that doctors should be male, and I'm not going to be treated by that person. However, if I'm in the room and I'm expecting to see a white male doctor, because that's what I see all the time, and a Black doctor walks in, honestly, for me, I'm going to be like, "Yo, awesome," right? But for some people, might not be, right?
It's a different experience, and it's a different, you talk about sort of these stereotypes or preconceived notions, right? And we talk about so many different types of bias in the workplace, right? We think about, affinity bias or recency bias, which is some of the ones that affect a little bit more of the work that we do internally. But, and I said earlier, these unique lived experiences, right? People are bringing those things into the workplace, right? So the bias landscape is expanded because
Right.
whatever it is that you think something should be, if it does not look like that across all the aspects or dimensions of your life, Now there is this expectation that, okay, well, yes, a doctor should be a man, or a surgeon should be a man, or, a global an HR leader should be a woman, or whatever the case may be, right? Sometimes in HR, when we talk about this, and I say this to some of my industry colleagues, when we talk about hiring, and they say, for us, diversity is a male, right? And so it kind of goes in the reverse. You see a lot of women in HR, right? But you see, you know, diversity being a male in any discipline of HR, right? Whether we're talking about compensation, or whether we're talking about, business partners, right? Which is what I do, or the team that I lead, right? And so, but the expectation, I think, is so unique when we look across the industries. And so you raise a really good point on things like, what are those biases, and how are they formed, and what are the uniquenesses that go along with them, so that when our expectations are not met, then our bias shows up, because then we are resistant to whatever it is that's in front of us, when, quite frankly, the person who's in front of you is probably educated, qualified, and deserves to be in that space, right? And
Right.
more than capable of executing whatever it is that you have come to them for, in terms of, subject matter expertise, or to actually apply some type of, action, or if you're looking for a resolution, right? And so it's just very interesting that you talk about bias in such a way that is expanding our mindset, or reshifting our expectations, or our perceived notions about what we think something to be, when the world is
Right.
evolved and progressed in such a way where we become in the minority if we don't start thinking bigger, right? And
Right.
then what does that mean for us as we decide we want to move forward, or what if we can't get past those biases,
Right.
right?
Well, and I think there's a note I just saw that I'm seeing some of the chat that's coming in, right? And I saw that Dr. Ledbetter said, in HR, right, trying to expand more men into HR is part of that. I remember seeing last year, I don't even remember what the story was about. It had something to do with a kindergarten teacher in France who was a man. But the story was about the idea that he had actually been moved from his post as a kindergarten teacher to like third grade instead, because he was covered in tattoos.
Mm.
And one child mentioned to their parents, a new kid, that he was scared of this kindergarten teacher, because I mean, literally, he was covered in tattoos, head to toe, neck, everything. And he'd been working there for quite a while with no incidents, right? But this one child said something, and so they said, well, we're going to move him from kindergarten to third grade. So that was what the story was. The story to me was the fact that this man, right, first point, got hired with all of these tattoos as a kindergarten teacher. I was like, wait, back up a minute.
What do kindergarten teachers look like? Like, what are they supposed to look like?
Right. And I was just like, that is so awesome that he got hired as a kindergarten teacher in the first place. But I was like, wait, so now they're going to move him? So that was what the story was. But for me, I was just like, kudos that he got hired in the first place. How do we do more of that?
You raised such a really great point, right? Like, again, it's this in our heads, what do kindergarten teachers look like? Or how do we think they should be, right? Should they be covered in tattoos from head to toe, right? And what does that mean, right? And does that define that man's ability to still offer whatever it is that we know kindergartners may need, right? Whether it's a certain level of nurturing, or a certain level of engagement, or whatever that looks like for that age, right? But does that make him incapable of being able to do that, based on the fact that he is covered from head to toe in
Right.
tattoos? So again, we kind of go back to the things that you were saying around with perception, and defining that perception, and again, bringing that experience into the workplace, right? So whatever your external experiences are generating these biases, and how do we change that, right? Like, how do we give ourselves permission to open up our minds and be okay with walking across a bridge, or even acknowledging the bridge, right? And saying, I'm starting here and I want to go there, right? But that means I got to own some stuff as I walk across the bridge to get to wherever there is, right? So
Right.
how do we encourage anybody to be that, leaders, or just people, each other, right? Like how what does it look like for us? I've been in this conversation with you, and I've thought once or twice, how are people perceiving us? Having a very intentional and open and thoughtful conversation around bias and representing some of what bias might look like for some people, right? And you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if you've thought about that, but I've had thought twice while we're talking about this, because you've raised some good points. And I'm thinking, man, here we are, right? Representing what might be biased to some people, but yet educating people at the same time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's such a dichotomy. And I think I'm going to answer your question, but then I think we'll go to Christina to start. I know there's quite a few questions coming in. But I think the conversation about how do we start to get over this, right? And lean into the conversation is we just have to start putting down walls. What I teach people, what I'm educating individuals on in our workshops is getting to know one another more, right? Because what we find is that if we can get to know people, like I believe we have the relationship label of coworker, right? And I'm like, that's not a relationship status. That's a label, right? You are a coworker. We don't actually have a relationship. We just happen to be two people that work in the same building, right? In order for us to really get to know one another, we need to build a relationship. We have to create a relationship. I need to learn a little bit more about you. I need to know who you are as a person. I need to know, do our values align in some fashion? We're working at the same company. So does that mean that we both believe in the goal of the company? Do we even know what the goal of the company is? Right? Like, these are conversations that we need to have, because when we get to really actually building relationships, then you can have those conversations with people, right? The problem is that we start trying to have conversations with people that we do not have a relationship with, which is why people are like, excuse me, who are you? Don't talk to me, right? Like, that's really what it boils down to. Is like, you don't know me like that.
Well, not only that, it doesn't speak to the framework you talk about in the book. So how do you ever get to advocacy if we can't start from this point of building relationships, right?
Exactly.
Like, you cannot go through the journey if you're not even starting with the most basic of steps, right? So I love that you sort of brought that full circle in terms of saying we have to start with building a relationship with someone. So that's how you navigate through everything, right? And
exactly.
Again, back to the basics, back to foundation. So.
Oh, sure. Well, I want to introduce Christina. Christina Kim is the lead coach and consultant at the Strengths Advantage, where she helps develop cultures of emotional wellness, intelligence, and leadership through personal and team strengths. And she's also a facilitator at Rework Work. She's new to the team. And so she has been monitoring the Q&A, and she's going to start throwing questions at us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stacey and Kim. The conversation was amazing. I mean, DEI is not an initiative, right? We need to start with relationship first. It has to be built into your core values. And I have to say, I have the opportunity to read the book also. And it is just a fabulous tool in itself, not just to educate, I think, about, to have educated myself about Unbias, but to actually have me start thinking about steps I can take within my own organization. So Stacey, thank you so much. We do have quite a few questions, so without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and start here. The first is, how do you go about making it clear to the C-suite that DEIB is not just something to be relegated to HR? How do we start having those conversations?
Yeah, there's three things that I always start with when I'm talking to executive leaders, and it's like the case for diversity, right? There's the business case, there's the moral case, and then there's also the compliance case, right? Which is, or the legal case. You've got to do all three, because if you only do one, if you say, well, it's the right thing to do, you are correct, but it's not sustainable, because if you're the leader and you believe that, but you haven't got everybody else to believe that, if you leave, if resources dry up, all of a sudden that goes by the wayside, right? If you're not at least on the compliance case and making sure that you've dotted all of your I's and crossed all of your T's, you're going to have a lawsuit. And if you are not looking at the business case, you're missing out on, productivity, high retention, all the financial positivity that comes out of having diversity. So those are the three places I start with, but it also has to come down to them being, they have to have some empathy, right? They have to understand what some of the trials and tribulations and the barriers that are in place at their workplace, and they can't really get it without really putting themselves in the shoes of others and having some empathy.
And empathy, right? We hear about that so much, not just in the DEI conversation, but just in organizational culture itself. So that importance of that empathy, most definitely. Thank you. The next question is, one participant put up that they are from the UK, and it's very clear that generally a certain group of people do not want to enter the conversation because they're afraid they'll be labeled as racist if they start to disagree with what's being said. How do we break down that inner fear they have? And is it my job to do? I think another way we might be able to think about this is that all of us have a fear that we might be labeled when we're entering into conversations. How do we work around that fear of being labeled?
Yeah, you have to step in, right? I think we talked about authenticity. Starting with, I might not say this correctly, but here's my question, right? I'm trying to get to a point, help me with that. And so we do have to give grace. We've got to give more grace for individuals and assume positive intent. But it also goes back to the relationship. Don't start having a difficult conversation with somebody that you do not have a relationship with, right? Unless it can't be avoided, but in many instances it kind of can. Like, why are you starting? You're starting in the wrong place, right? You're starting in the middle. Build the relationship first, then have the conversation. Don't have the conversation first because you're probably going to do it wrong and you're going to explode that relationship and there will be no foundation for future relationship.
Just building that safety and that security, again, that bond of the relationship where you're open to ask these questions and to go in with an attitude of learning as opposed to going in and setting yourself up for those labels. Thank you, Stacey. There's another question here that says, I've experienced that there's a fine balance between just hashtag just ask and hashtag educate yourself. Also that people of color have found it to be very frustrating being in a group of white people muddling through, and then their role turns to education. What are your thoughts on those?
I definitely have some thoughts, but I want to ask Kim if she's got a thought first before we jump.
So I do, and so I think this is a question, and I'm sure Stacey, this comes up for you often as well, right? But people of color find themselves to always be in the seat of, what I like to refer to as bridge building. So saying, this is what it is, I'm going to bring this to you, or I'm going to bring you to the bridge, right? Or I'm going to help you find your comfort or your path across to be able to do that, right? And in particular, right, this is an experience I think Black women have often, right? We are sitting in the seat of not only educating, but then also having, educating about what the issue is or the context or the history is, but then also being at the point of saying, and this is the place where we now start to begin to heal or course correct or do the work or implement, whatever change that we want to get to, but facilitating that conversation repeatedly. It does get to be something that you have to have the endurance for, both mentally and emotionally, because you find yourself there so often simply by a dimension of diversity that you didn't get to decide about yourself, right? I didn't get to choose being a woman, I didn't get to choose being a person of color, right? This is who I am and this is what I lead with, but it's also the thing that puts me in this marginalized space of always having to be the educator, both for the context and then designing what the journey is. And so I think going back to things that Stacey said, which is you just have to be vulnerable enough to say, here's what I don't know. And I want to know if you'd be willing to share these things with me, or what are the right questions that I should be asking to learn, right? So that I can educate myself, or what are the right resources out there, or how often could you and I have a touch point or a conversation, or what are the experiences that you think that are important for me to know about, either that you've had, right? But either way, you've got to lead with something, right, that shows your willingness to be vulnerable and your willingness to, truly educate yourself, so that the just ask is intentional, right? If we go back to some of that intentionality we spoke about earlier, Stacey, I don't know if that resonates with you, but that's
a perfect point, right? There's two sides to it. And I think that for those that are asking, before you ask, ask yourself a question. Can I find this through Google? Right? Because I get emails from people saying, well, could you send me resources? Can you, it's almost like I'm supposed to send a dissertation. The questions that I get, it's like, are you kidding me? You want me? So I'm going to go Google, find the information and send it to you. I don't even respond to those. I've given up. I've stopped responding, right? So that's the first question is, before you ask me a question, ask yourself a question. Can I find this through Google? Can I find this through the Pepperdine Library? Am I an alum? And can I use the Pepperdine resources, right? Like, I'm sure that there is information out there for you. So I think some of it, again, I go back to this, we are lazy, right? We want to shortcut. We want to go to somebody and have them explain it to us. Explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old. Okay, I'm going to speak to you like you're a 5-year-old. Go ask Alexa, right? So I think that that's a first point. The second point is, if you are authentic about it and you want to have a conversation, then we're going to feel that, right? When somebody asks a question, you can tell when it's I'm just saying this because I want to get under your skin and I don't really want to hear what you have to say about it because I have an opposing point and I just want to make my opposing point all over you and I'm going to make you work, right, to prove me wrong. And it's like, I don't have time to get into that kind of exhaustive exercise, right? So understanding that many of us have had to do this a lot, that yes, you might get jumped on if you come with a question that can easily be answered elsewhere. So give us a little grace and do that. But if you're coming from a place of authenticity, it will be felt, it will be understood. And if we have some sort of relationship, I would know that already, right? So that also helps that conversation. Keep bringing it back to create relationships.
Wow, thank you so much. The last question that I have here, because just taking consideration into time is, taking time into consideration is, what if there are employees who view DEI as a burden? How do you inspire all employees to invest? Is that possible?
Oh, I love this question. I'm so glad this question came up. I'm glad it came up because there's a quote that I want to use. I don't know who to attribute it to, but you can't help everyone, right? So when we say preaching to the choir, for me in DEI work, preaching to the choir, that's where you want to do it, right? You want to preach to the choir. Why? Because your choir is going to go out and preach to other people too, right? That's how we evangelize DEI. It doesn't make any sense to start with the people who don't want to hear you, who have not bought in, who don't understand, because you're just going to keep butting your head against the brick wall and you're just going to end up with a bloody forehead, right? And we're not going to have any progress. So you have to start with the people who are interested and help them help others, right? And we do it in that way. Part of that is, though, so we go back to values, right? And what are the values of your organization? Because if your organization believes in these values, and I saw this on LinkedIn the other day, there was a question about, should CEOs be able to speak out about things outside of their company? Yeah, they definitely should. But you know what? What you're saying should not be misaligned with the company, because guess what? You are the CEO. And so if your values are not aligned to the values of the company, you should not be CEO. So there shouldn't be a situation where you are speaking out and saying something that is misaligning, or that is opposite of what the company might believe, because again, you were the CEO. And you were leading the company. So if you don't agree, you shouldn't be CEO. You need to find a different job in a different company, right? So back to the quote. The quote is that we are either going to change the people or we're going to change the people. And so it's like, we're going to come in and we're going to change you and understand that this is what our values are. And if you don't like it, you can leave. And I completely, wholeheartedly agree with that, because you know what, when you make change, sometimes you're going to leave people behind, but that means that you're going to leave space for others who are interested in joining. And we're not talking about bandwagoning, right? We're not saying we want everyone to all be the same and think the same and only, be in this cult. That's not what we're saying, but we are saying that as we're moving forward, we should at least be aligned on values.
Kim, I see you shaking your head.
Well, and I think it also goes back to this, this notion of intentionality. Earlier in the conversation, Stacey said, if you've got a time frame to be able to do this work, right, maybe you need to add some time to that in order to be able to really kind of get to this space. And I think that's what that's what I mean when I say, go slow. Sometimes we have to go slow to go fast. We have to slow down to take some of those initial steps, right? To get to the place that Stacey is talking about, which is, are we clear on our values, right? And is everybody aligned on that, right? The tone at the top is going to impact the trickle down. So do we need to take the time to be able to do that? And so when I hear Stacey talk about that intentionality, I think there's a lot there that really can be explored if you're intentional about the time, intentional about what your end goal is, and then really looking at saying, am I in the right place to be able to do this? Am I aligned to the values that this organization has? And if not, maybe I need to go and discover that somewhere else, right? Or with somewhere else, or do the work to be able to get there, right? So, I think you capped us off beautifully, right? With a very a good thought to end our conversation.
All right, let me go ahead and turn it back to Dr. Ledbetter so she can go ahead and help close our conversation today.
Thank you so much, Christina. Please join me in thanking this fabulous group of people, especially Stacey Gordon and Kim Blue Terell, for sharing their insight and wisdom with us. This is absolutely priceless, and we're so grateful. And Christina, thank you so much for facilitating the discussion. I want to thank you for joining us to celebrate Women's History Month as we bring this month to a close, and especially for celebrating the launch of Stacey's book, Unbias, Addressing Unconscious Bias in the Workplace. Again, that's available on Amazon. For anyone who wants to take a look at that, you can see Stacey's model in there. I especially want to remind us all that DEI is not an initiative. It is a way of thinking and a way of being. So we have to stay connected to this work. And if we don't know, we need to ask. And we can lengthen our strategy in order to reduce bias and to remember that bias is not negative. It's a state of being. And it's very much affected by so much that we grow up with and that we're exposed to. So we get to do the work of training and teaching ourselves how to think about what it means to lead with greater sense of awareness to reduce unconscious bias. Thank you, everyone, for joining us so much. We're so grateful for your time and presence with us today. I'll bring our session to a close, but the work just begins today. It keeps going on. So please take a look at these great thoughts that Stacey's put together in her book, and we'll see you next time when we offer our next event through the Center for Women in Leadership at the Graziadio Business School at Pepperdine University. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day. Take good care. All the best. Bye for now.
Thank you all.
Bye.